Microsoft just got approval to buy Bethesda because they're the only ones that know how to do it. $7.5 billion. That is how much Microsoft is going to be paying for ZeniMax, or as we all know them, Bethesda. This is Microsoft's, I believe, largest gaming acquisition ever, has just cleared its major final hurdles. I say plural because most of us were waiting for the EU announcement, but also the US officially cleared Microsoft to be able to buy Bethesda. And now the EU has also said, hey, you know what? You can as well, which puts into motion a bunch of steps. Primarily, Uncle Satya, or I should say Uncle Phil, going into their bank account, typing in the routing and account numbers of ZeniMax and shipping over $7.5 billion dues into their bank account, and then taking ownership of the IP that is in that brand. Now, this is just on all regards, a massive acquisition, a massive bet for Microsoft, and just a cataclysmic shakeup to the gaming industry as a whole. Now, Microsoft will officially come out and announce, and I'm sure there'll be fireworks and everything else talking about it, but there's a lot of things we still don't know. But let's just kind of just work backwards through the facts here. So, $7.5 billion acquisition approved. The commission officially concluded, they said the commission concluded that the proposed acquisition would raise no competition concerns given the combined entity's limited market position upstream and the presence of strong downstream competitors in the distribution of video games. So that's the EU saying, like, look, if Microsoft buys ZeniMax or Bethesda, it's not going to, tilt the scales of the gaming community so heavily in Microsoft's favor that nobody else can compete. They rule that out and say that's not going to be happening, and it makes a lot of sense. There's a ton of gaming studios. There's a lot of games out there, and Microsoft is not buying the lion's share, although they are buying one of the largest developers and publishers in the industry, which will have big effects long term for Microsoft. So, couple of the big titles I think many people watching this will probably know, but anyways, in case you are new to Bethesda and ZeniMax, this includes, and this is not limited to, but are some of the bigger titles. So you get Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, Doom, Wolfenstein, Starfield, I think Prey. There's a bunch of other titles that will now be in the Microsoft portfolio once they officially sign off and conclude that, but I'm pretty sure that is going to wrap up here very quickly because Microsoft is going to want to move quite fast to get these titles under its brand and its portfolio and start making decisions. Because you got to remember, up until today, it was illegal for Microsoft to go over to Bethesda and be like, hey, stop development of that, don't do this, like they could not do that. That's illegal for a number of reasons. And so now with the clearing of this, Microsoft can now sign the check and then start making decisions. Which brings up a question. What are the decisions that Microsoft is going to make? We've all been kind of floating around wondering, like, is Microsoft going to sign this deal and then immediately claw back everything that had been done for PlayStation and other platforms? It's an honest and valid question, and Microsoft hasn't really explicitly said what they're going to do, primarily because I don't think they could, right? They can't make these decisions again until everything is signed off. But here's how I personally think this is going to play out, and there's some big things here we need to talk about, too, at the end about how only Microsoft can really do this. Because Microsoft is in a position where they're going to be, they're buying Bethesda, and obviously they want all the stuff just on their platform. But at the end of the day, Bethesda was valued at a level of building games and selling games on other platforms, namely PlayStation. And so would Microsoft want to pull that back and take money quite literally off the table from this acquisition on day one? I honestly can't see that happening because Bethesda is going to be probably fairly far along in development of some certain titles that are going to be headed to PlayStation. If Microsoft goes in there and says, hey, all these titles, they're dead. We're not building that anymore. They just devalued the asset that they bought. And maybe they want to do that, but I don't personally think they're going to be wanting to do that based on just what we've heard Phil say. I mean, Phil likes exclusives. He loves things in Game Pass. He loves things on Xbox first, but he doesn't seem like the type of person who's just going to gut Bethesda and all those people working on PlayStation stuff just because Microsoft closed the acquisition. My gut tells me that they will just kind of ride out, first off, if they have any existing contracts, they have to honor them or they have to pay a significant penalty for canceling those contracts. So that's a whole separate issue. But my gut tells me that they will ship the titles onto PlayStation when it's appropriate and where it makes sense because they're so far along in the development and Microsoft would like to just make that money. I mean, that's the reality of business. But what I do see them doing is putting everything into Game Pass. And I think that's pretty much a given. But Microsoft is going to work hard to make their titles that do exist on both platforms. They're going to make them better on Xbox. They're going to give them exclusive features, maybe side quests, maybe additional characters, maybe additional DLC. Microsoft is certainly going to nurture its own platforms while both parties exist on both platforms if they go that route. I think that is pretty much, I think that's a pretty logical approach to what Microsoft is going to do. Now, long term, we know that Microsoft is certainly going to be favoring Xbox Game Pass and Game Pass on the PC. Microsoft is doing everything they can to make those platforms even better, and by bringing Bethesda in-house, that is going to go a long way to making that happen. Which brings up a really, really interesting point about what is going on here in the gaming industry. Because if you look at the other major tech players, now I'm excluding Sony from this, and you'll see why in a second. But when you look at Microsoft, you look at Amazon, you look at Google, you look at Apple, only Microsoft is able to build up game studios. Look, Google tried and then they just closed it down. Amazon has also tried and just closed it down. These companies, namely not Microsoft, don't quite realize that game development for big brand titles like AAA, Quad A, whatever you want to call them, takes years, 5 years even. In Halo Infinite's case, even longer than that potentially. And so these bigger tech companies don't quite understand the gaming model as well as Microsoft does, which puts them in a very, very unique position that they're the only major platform in the streaming wars right now, and I'm excluding Sony for reasons which we'll talk about here in a second, that is able to do this. And they're the only company that is actively developing tons and tons of IP, and now with Bethesda coming in, they're going to have even more, and they're setting themselves up to have a nice systematic release cadence of titles over a very long period of time, which is what the gaming development needs, or gaming market needs, and also the gamers need to stay included or subscribed to Game Pass. And Microsoft is the only company right now positioned to do that. Now, you can make that same argument for Sony, but the reason why I left Sony out is that Sony is not, they're a tech player, but they're not the major tech players when you think about the industry, right? Sony doesn't have a multi-instance major cloud that's around the entire globe like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google do. And so Microsoft is in that unique position of having its own cloud, having its own game streaming service, and having a ton of titles that other companies can't quite match in that regard, which kind of honestly makes me wonder if Sony would ever, I can't imagine that PlayStation brand would ever get acquired from Sony, but man, you could imagine that somebody like Amazon or Google would love to snatch them up so that they could replicate what Microsoft has built. It's one of those interesting positions where Microsoft is really a market leader in the game development, game distribution, and game streaming segment. It's a really, really neat narrative to follow right now, and this all just tails on the back of Microsoft closing its largest acquisition in the gaming space ever. $7.5 billion is just a cataclysmic amount of money. I mean, if you stacked all that up, it would be big. That's the best analogy I got for you here on an early Monday morning. But this is the final set of hurdles that Microsoft had to cross to get there. They didn't need funding. Microsoft has all the money in their bank account. All they needed was regulatory approval to close this deal. And now that they have received that from both the major players in the EU and the US, there's really nothing stopping them from closing it. The question is Microsoft going to announce this today, or are they going to hold off until their event later in March, where they might be talking about more games? We've heard March 23rd, and that seems to be a logical timeline right now. We don't have the exactly date yet because Microsoft hasn't announced it, but they were aiming for an event later in March, which is where I would expect them to see one, obviously talk about Bethesda, but then more than likely I believe like iOS or definitely desktop streaming should be talked about, and we might see some other fun things at that event that I'm hearing about. So anyways, we'll just keep our eyes and ears peeled. I would expect Microsoft to make some big noise once they officially close this, and now we got to be watching for Microsoft's next step in this space. And if you are wondering what the next steps are going to be, keep it subscribed to this channel, because the only BS on this channel is me. Kind of flubbed that a little.